What happened at Chernobyl was not just an accident. It was the moment everything went wrong at the exact same time. And in the early hours of April 26, 1986, one deadly chain of mistakes turned a routine safety test into the worst nuclear disaster in history. At 1:23 in the morning, reactor number 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant exploded, not once, but twice. The steel and concrete top of the reactor was ripped apart. Fire burst into the sky, radioactive material escaped into the air, and in just a few seconds, a power plant built to provide electricity to millions became a disaster that would affect the world for decades. But Chernobyl did not begin with the explosion. It began years earlier, with ambition, pressure, and a reactor design that carried hidden danger. After World War II, the Soviet Union poured huge amounts of money into nuclear power. It wanted progress. It wanted power. It wanted to show the world that it was modern and strong. One of the results was the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, built near the town of Pripyat in what is now Ukraine. The plant used RBMK-1000 reactors. They were powerful, they were efficient, and they had serious flaws. There were 4 reactors at Chernobyl. Reactor 1 began operating in 1977. Reactor 2 followed, then Reactor 3. And finally Reactor 4, the one that would become famous around the world for all the wrong reasons. Each reactor could produce around 1,000 megawatts of electricity. Together, they supplied a huge amount of power to the region. To many people, Chernobyl looked like a symbol of the future. In reality, it was a machine with dangerous weaknesses. To understand why Chernobyl happened, you need to understand how a nuclear reactor works. Inside the reactor are fuel rods. These rods contain uranium. When uranium atoms split, they release heat. That heat turns water into steam. The steam spins turbines, and the turbines generate electricity. But nuclear power is not simple. It must be controlled at every second. That is the job of the control rods. These rods absorb neutrons and slow the nuclear reaction. When they are inserted deeper, the reaction slows down. When they are pulled out, the reaction speeds up. And at Chernobyl, there was another critical part of the system, graphite. In the RBMK design, graphite acted as a moderator. It helped sustain the reaction by making it easier for more fission to continue. That system worked only if everything stayed under control. But on the night of the disaster, nothing stayed under control. The workers were preparing a safety test. The idea sounded simple. If the plant suddenly lost external power, could the spinning turbines keep generating enough electricity for a short time to run the water pumps until the backup generators started? That sounds like a reasonable question, but the way the test was handled was not safe. The test had already been delayed once. The staff were tired. The night shift was under pressure, and the reactor was being pushed into a condition it was never meant to handle. At first, the reactor power was lowered. Then something unexpected happened. The power dropped much lower than planned. Why? Because of xenon poisoning is a byproduct of nuclear fission, and it absorbs neutrons very efficiently. In a reactor, that means it acts like a brake. When too much xenon builds up, the reaction slows down sharply. That is exactly what happened here. The operators tried to recover the power by removing control rods, and they removed too many, way too many. At one point, the reactor was left with only a small number of control rods inserted, far below the safe limit. That was a major violation of safety rules, but the team kept going because they wanted to complete the test. At around 1:00 in the morning on April 26, the reactor power started rising again. Then came the most dangerous moment. As the power increased, the water in the core began turning into steam, and that was a huge problem. Because steam does not cool the reactor as well as water does, so the less water there was, the hotter the reactor became, and the hotter it became, the more steam formed. That created a feedback loop, a dangerous loop, a fast loop, a loop that made the reactor more and more unstable every second. The operators saw warning signs. They realized the reactor was getting out of control. At 1:23 in the morning, they hit the emergency shutdown button. That should have stopped the reaction. That should have saved the reactor. But at Chernobyl, the design itself turned against them. The control rods had graphite tips, and when those rods were inserted, the graphite tips briefly increased the reaction in the lower part of the core before the boron section could slow it down. At that exact moment, with the reactor already unstable, that design flaw became catastrophic. The power surged, the reaction spiked, and seconds later, the first explosion tore through reactor 4. Then came the second explosion. The 1,000-ton reactor cover was blasted upward. The core was exposed, the graphite inside caught fire, and radioactive material was thrown into the atmosphere. At 1:26 in the morning, the fire alarm started ringing. Firefighters rushed to the scene. They did not know they were walking into one of the most dangerous places on Earth. They thought they were dealing with an ordinary fire. They had no real warning, no real protection. And many of them were exposed to deadly radiation without fully understanding what they were facing. The fire burned for days. It was not easy to stop because graphite was involved, and the reactor remained extremely hot. Helicopters were sent in to drop sand, clay, lead, and boron onto the burning reactor in an attempt to slow the spread of radiation and smother the fire. It was a terrifying operation. Some of the men involved paid with their lives. And the firefighters who worked that night and the days after suffered terrible consequences. This was not a normal fire. This was a nuclear fire. As radioactive materials spread through the air, the impact went far beyond Ukraine. Radiation was detected across Europe. In some places, radioactive fallout reached soil, grass, and food supplies. In the United Kingdom, radioactive rain was reported in certain areas. In parts of Europe, radioactive particles settled on grass eaten by cows, and then that milk became contaminated. One of the biggest long-term health effects was thyroid cancer in children, especially linked to radioactive iodine. The disaster was now no longer local, it was international. At first, the Soviet authorities tried to hide what had happened, but they could not hide it for long. Swedish monitoring stations detected unusually high radiation levels. Once experts traced the source, it became clear that a major accident had taken place in the Soviet Union. The government finally admitted the disaster on April 28, 2 days after the explosion. By then, the damage was already done. Soon after, the area around the plant was evacuated. Pripyat, the city built for Chernobyl workers and their families, was abandoned. People left behind homes, schools, toys, books, furniture, and entire lives. They were told they would return soon. They never did. A 30-kilometer exclusion zone was created around the plant. It became one of the most famous restricted areas in the world. To contain the reactor, the Soviet Union built a huge concrete and steel structure over the wreckage, often called the sarcophagus. It was designed to trap the radiation as quickly as possible, but it was never a perfect or permanent solution. Years later, cracks and deterioration became a serious concern, and a new, larger containment structure was built over the old one. This new safe confinement was designed to help isolate the remains of Reactor 4 for decades to come. The human cost of Chernobyl was enormous. Thousands of people took part in the cleanup. They became known as liquidators. They removed contaminated debris, cleaned rooftops, built barriers, buried radioactive material, and carried out some of the most dangerous cleanup work ever attempted. Many of them were exposed to high levels of radiation. Many suffered for years, and many lives were changed forever. Chernobyl also became a symbol of something much bigger. It exposed the danger of secrecy. It exposed the danger of poor communication. It exposed the danger of designing powerful technology without fully respecting its risks. And it exposed the cost of putting pressure and pride ahead of safety. The disaster is often seen as one of the major events that weakened trust in the Soviet system and helped push it toward collapse. It also changed nuclear policy around the world. After Chernobyl, countries and scientists took reactor safety much more seriously. New safety standards were strengthened, operators became more cautious, and the world was forced to ask a hard question: how do you control something powerful enough to light up cities, but dangerous enough to destroy them? Today, the area around Chernobyl remains mostly empty. Nature has returned in surprising ways. Wolves, deer, boars, lynx, eagles, and bears live in parts of the exclusion zone. Buildings still stand in ruins. Roads are still cracked and silent. And the land still carries the memory of what happened there. Chernobyl is not just a story about a reactor. It is a story about human error, a story about flawed design, a story about secrecy, and a story about how one night, in just a few terrifying minutes, the world changed forever. This was Chernobyl, the worst nuclear disaster in history, and a warning that still matters today.